And please, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ed. And it's a real pleasure to join you all today. In fact, Ed, it's your work, along with many other people, that makes us work so hard, because it's one thing to have an idea of a donut and draw it as a picture in a book. But it's then when you meet people who say, oh, we're bringing this to life in Costa Rica, we're using it as a measure of national progress, or in Amsterdam, or in Copenhagen and Colombia and many other places that we're going to hear of. So thank you for your work and for turning ideas into practice. So I'm Kate Raworth. I'm the author of Doughnut Economics, and I'm delighted to give a presentation today of what is Doughnut Economics, what are the core ideas at the heart of it. And then I'm really delighted to be followed by my colleague Andrew Fanning, who works with me at the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, and he's going to talk about downscaling the donut to nations and cities. So we hope we're going to give you the conceptual foundations and then the practical downscaling. So lots and lots to talk about after our presentations. So I'm going to share my screen because for me, pictures are very powerful, and I'm going to show a lot of pictures today. Let me just turn this thing off. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So I would like to share with you the foundational ideas of Doughnut Economics. Why? Because whether or not you studied economics, economic mindsets and framing shape the world we live in. They shape the conversations that happen in parliaments. They shape conversations in business boardrooms. They shape the conversation in the media. And therefore, whether or not you've studied economics, economic theory shapes the way we all talk about the economy, what it is, how it works, who we are in it. And we need to change that, because the theories that have been taught in economics departments worldwide, I believe, are still deeply outdated and are too much based in theories from past centuries that in no way reflect our own. So what I want to do is give you a whirlwind tour of what I think of as 20th century economics, still far too widely taught, what's wrong with it, and then we're going to very quickly replace it with 21st century economic ideas, what I call Doughnut Economics. So 20th century economics, this really is a whirlwind tour, but I can tell it to you through the story of just a handful of pictures. The starting point, if I was to ask everybody on this line right now, what's the starting point? I can bet you, if I said, what's the first diagram you ever remember encountering? I can bet you I know the answer, because it's the same the world over. It's this crisscross of supply and demand. As if to say, welcome to economics, here is the market. The market is essentially the economy. It puts price at the center of our vision. And it means that anything that falls outside of the price contract is seen as an externality. So we find ourselves in this extraordinarily bizarre situation that we are asked to talk about the death of the living world as an environmental externality. If you listen to the words, alarm bells should go off in your head, that framing in no way equips us for the century we're in, and it deeply disrespects the living world upon which we all depend. What about the self-portrait? Humanity's portrait is rational economic man, and he never gets drawn in the textbook, so I decided he needed a picture that captured his essential traits. So here he is. He's a man. He's standing alone with no dependents. He's got money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the real problem with him is not how absurdly narrow that portrait is. The real problem is that on being told that he's like us, we actually become more like him. So researchers have found that from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 of university, students more say they value competition and self-interest as economic traits over collaboration and altruism. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. Thirdly, what's the goal? Well, the goal is never stated, because economics wants to be a science, and science apparently doesn't have goals. And so a cuckoo goal creeps into its place, and it's the goal of never-ending growth, GDP, that must rise and rise. No matter how rich a country already is, its policymakers and economists believe that its solutions lie in yet more growth. The growth, actually, that framework of growth deeply underpins two of the most damaging stories about the dynamics of economics that dominated the second half of the 20th century. So the story in Inequality, how does inequality change as countries get richer? A brilliant economist called Simon Kuznets in the 1950s gathered a little bit of data from the UK, the US, and Germany of what happens to inequality over time. And he plotted it on the page, and it looked a bit like that. And he was surprised. He said, I did not expect to see that first inequality gets worse, but then it gets better. He didn't expect the rich to the poor to catch up. He thought the rich would just keep getting richer. But this is what the data showed. Now, by the time it's drawn on the page, this picture takes on a power of its own. And this, known as the Kuznets curve, whispered out a very, very powerful message. The growth will even things up again. So if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute in society. You see, you'll actually get in the way of growth, and growth will even things up again. Look at the data, you see. So tighten your belts. Let's go for trickle-down economics. Let's endure austerity. We'll all come out better in the end, except we don't. It doesn't work. The richest countries in the world are not the most equal countries in the world. That has been debunked, because Thomas Piketty came along in 2014 and said, actually, let me go back and look at that data. He did. He said, Kuznets was right. That's what the data showed at the time. But you know what? Kuznets was measuring this at a very unusual time in history, before war and after war. And war destroys the capital of the wealthy, and governments post-war invested in health and education and housing. So it's war and government intervention that bent that curve down in those countries. It's not the inherent workings of the market. So that's been debunked. We cannot rely on growth to even things up again. Once it was debunked, though, in the 1990s, along came another curve on the question of environment. Some economists started looking at local air and water pollution and what happened over time as countries got richer. And they drew this curve and they said, wow, it looks so like the Kuznets curve. We're going to sort of rather unimaginatively just call it the environmental Kuznets curve. And this curve, again, whispers out a very powerful message that growth will clean up after itself. Like a very well-trained child, any parent knows that ain't gonna happen, right? The idea that as nations grow, first there's more pollution, but then as they get richer, that pollution will be cleaned up. Well, the economists who did this work in the 1990s admitted they only had local air and water pollutant data. And even those actually over time do not get cleaned up in the richest economies. I live in the UK. There are plenty of places in the UK where air pollution is very high and children are often not allowed to play in the playground at school. But this only took account of local pollutants. When you bring in global pollutants, that curve does not bend down. It takes an awful lot of intervention to even start to turn that corner. So these two curves are complete falsehoods, but they had extraordinary power in the late 20th century. Growth will clean up after itself. Growth will even things up again. We need to let them go, because the 21st century has begun in a very, very different way, with repeated crises, with financial meltdown and food price crises in 2008, with climate breakdown as the backdrop of our era, and most recently COVID lockdown. And the inequalities that these bring up are heightened by gender and race, by wealth and power, by global north and global south. These shocks are emerging from the very systems we've created. And for many people, they are literally existential threats to their lives and livelihoods. So we need to transform our economic systems. And I love this quote from Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change a model, to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So I'm not going to waste my time fighting what's wrong with 20th century economics. I'm just going to shut those books, put them back on the shelf, take out a pen. Let's start again. What if we start with a blank page and a pen? What would we first draw? What are the first concepts that we want our children and ourselves to encounter when we think about the economy? Well, for me, I think it starts with purpose, because I was taught economics never with any purpose. That's how growth crept in. So what if we start by saying, what's the purpose of the economy? What's our aim? And this is where I offer you a donut, the only one that's good for us. The goal here, and this is a compass for human prosperity, the goal is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating from the center, which means we want to leave nobody in the hole in the middle, falling short on those essentials of life. I've crowdsourced these from the world's governments, so The power of that is that every government in the world has already agreed that every person in the world has a claim to meeting these. Get everybody over the social foundation into the green ring, but don't go so far that you overshoot that ecological ceiling. And these are the 9 planetary boundaries, Earth's life-supporting systems that make this one habitable planet known in the universe, such a home sweet home for humanity, with a stable climate and fertile soils and abundant biodiversity and bountiful water and a protective ozone layer overhead. So meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And if I do that with my hand, you can already sense that this shape of progress this century is very different. It's not ever rising growth. It's thriving in balance, almost like a heartbeat. In fact, when I looked at the images that many ancient cultures have drawn to symbolize well-being, I was so struck that they all capture something about a dynamic thriving in balance. And it suddenly makes you realize that the Western concept of progress lying in endless growth, that is the outlier. That is the exception to humanity's much wider conceptions of what well-being looks like. So if our well-being lies in dynamic balance, of course, the truth, we know it, and I saw it in the chat as we began, people saying, is this the 11th hour? The truth is we are way out of balance on both sides. So all of the red in this picture shows you the extent to which people are falling short on the essentials of life or overshooting. People worldwide in countries rich and poor cannot meet their most essential needs. We want to eliminate all the red from the middle of that picture. And we are already over at least 4 of these planetary boundaries. So 21st century challenge, in my mind, our generational challenge is to come back into this image from both sides. It's humanity's selfie, and we are the first generation to see it, right? Last century's economists and policymakers and business leaders and community activists, they never saw this. This was not their challenge. This is not what they were trying to solve. It's ours. And we've got to come up with new theories and policies and business models and community actions that take this on. So how? Well, I want to start again with new pictures. So if we could draw the first picture of the economy that we encounter, what would it be? For me, it's this. I call it the embedded economy diagram. And if you're familiar with ecological economics and feminist economics and commons theory, I hope you'll see them all in here. So we've got the economy is embedded in society. It is a social construct. We invented it. It's just a set of human social relations, and we can reinvent it. And society is embedded in the living world, humanity within the web of life. Drawing in materials and matter, putting out waste and pollution, bathed in a river of solar energy. So from day one, we can ask the critical question of ecological economics. How big can the economy's throughput be before we begin to disrupt the life supporting systems of planet Earth? But look inside the economy. Let's go inside. We've got the market, and mainstream economics starts there. But when we start with the market, then who we show up as, who our personality is consumer or producer. Are you shopping or working, or shopping or working, or shopping or working? And when you're working, critically, are you the laborer taking home a wage, or are you the owner taking home the profits? That matters. That's just a tiny slice of our economic identities. Let's jump to the state. We may be public servant, recognized more than ever during times of COVID. We may be resident, a public service user, a voter, a protester, and these are all critical roles we play in relation to the state. The 20th century was obsessed with the ideological boxing match between these two. Are you a free market, laissez-faire capitalist, or a state-loving socialist? And in this boxing match, lost sight, and I will say that boxing match was dominated by male economists who were the predominant economists of the 20th century. And so they lost sight of 2 other fundamental sources of our well-being. The household, where we all begin every day. We're all locked in right now in many countries, where we may be parent or partner or relative or child, caring for others, providing meals, providing homeschooling, care, nursing the sick back to health, doing the washing, cooking, sweeping, cleaning, getting labor ready for work. Labor doesn't just show up fresh and clean, ready for work every day. All the household work does the reproduction to make that happen. But of course, it's totally unregarded by the paid economy. So it's been ignored for centuries. And then the commons, where people come together, not through the market or the state, but as a community, following rules that they have collectively agreed to co-produce goods and services they collectively value. whether it's a community kitchen, a tree planting nursery, an after school club, Wikipedia on the World Wide Web, a garden on the corner of your neighborhood block. So as a volunteer, a sharer, a co-creator, a steward. Now suddenly this multiplicity of economic roles gives us a much, much richer starting point for thinking about ourselves as actors in the economy. And I just want to offer people a takeaway question to ask yourself. Oh yeah, and we've moved from the me of rational economic man to the we of society, right? So ask yourself, how do these multiple economic roles show up in your own life? I think we all move through all of them just about every day. We pass through them seamlessly that we don't get to name them. But I just invite you as a takeaway to think, how do they intersect in my life? Where's the tension between them? And again, the horizontal shows up in GDP, market and state. The vertical is invisible in GDP and yet critical to our well-being. And you can also ask yourself, how do these currently play out in your country? What do you think is the balance between them? What needs to be changed? What's the tension? What would you rather see as a rebalancing between them? So that's the embedded economy. If we start from there, how can we get into the donut? How do we close down this massive overshoot that tells us we are running down the living planet in a deeply degenerative design? And this tells us we are a deeply unequal global community because billions of people can't meet their most basic needs. But collectively, we've totally overshot our pressure on planetary resources. So let's just remember that Kuznets curve ain't going to happen. Growth is not just going to even things up again. If the global economy just keeps growing, the problem of inequality isn't going to go away. And if the global economy just keeps growing, we won't naturally come back within planetary boundaries, far from it. So we need new values to pursue. And I replace these two with these two design principles: to be distributive by design and to be regenerative by design. And that's really what I want to focus much of what I'm going to say on now. I'll describe each of them. So distributive by design. So a divisive economy is one that drives value and concentrates value and opportunity into few hands. We live in a global economy in which the number of billionaires has increased over the last decade from 1,000 to 2,000. So on the global scale, that's certainly happening. We need to create distributive economies where value and opportunity are shared far more equitably with all who co-create and use them, shared through many hands. And that's a healthy system, like blood flowing through the body. It's distributive, it moves and circulates. So some examples. To me, the first place is investment in the human potential, right? Each one of us is a node in the network. The most fundamental investments that can be made is in our health and our education. And Ethiopia, across sub-Saharan African countries, Ethiopia is recognized as a country that has done better than most in terms of investing in health and education and massively improving those outcomes in recent years. Employment. Instead of having massive corporations where the profits are all distributed to shareholders who would sell the stock at a moment's notice if its price fell, what if we create enterprises that are owned by their employees, like the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland, Ohio, that are creating, they're growing horticulture, installing solar panels on roofs like this, they're running laundries, run by the employees, so the value is retained in the community. Housing. In Chile, the architect Alejandro Aravena realized that many people would never be able to buy a house, just too expensive. But he thought, maybe they could afford half a house. So he started designing and building half houses with all the heating and plumbing and electricity you'd need. People could buy half a house, and when they'd saved up enough, they could fill the rest in. And with that simple, literal design plan change, he made housing ownership accessible to a far wider community and saved many tens of thousands of people from living a life of paying rent for the rest of their years. And then in Bangladesh, look across these rooftops and look carefully, because if you look carefully, you'll notice there are little solar panels everywhere. And these solar panels are connected in a microgrid within the village, so that all of these houses are connected up to each other, every household generating its own electricity and then able to use it or sell it on to their neighbors. So this is empowering people to generate electricity and as a source of income. I think these are really powerful examples, very, very different from each other, of distributive design. And I just invite you to ask, What distributive possibilities did these inspire for you thinking about your country? So that's one side of the story, distributive design. And then the other side, regenerative design. So this is the linear degenerative economy that we've inherited, where we take Earth's materials, we make it into stuff we want, we use it for a while, often only once, and then we throw it away. And this is what it looks like when we take again and again and again from Earth's sources. And this is what it looks like when we throw our waste again and again and again into Earth's sinks, plastics into lakes and rivers, electronic waste into the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people. And it's disgusting. I really genuinely believe your grandchildren and mine will pull photographs like this from the archives, and they will say to us, did you know about this? Did you ever see it? Because they will not be able to believe that we thought this was acceptable, of what we do to the planet and what we do to other people. So they'll know that we have to take these linear arrows and bend them round and turn them into a circular or cyclical or regenerative economy where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, more collectively, and more creatively. And as you can see here on this classic diagram of the circular economy, the butterfly diagram, separating biological nutrients, let nature regenerate herself. If we just get out of the way, she regenerates, turns things back into building blocks and recreates life. And technical nutrients or human-made materials, we need to restore and refurbish and reuse and recycle, mimicking nature's cycles. So this is an economy that works with and within the cycles of the living world. It runs on sunlight. The key principle is that waste from one process becomes food for another. It's going to be modular by design so that things can be taken apart and put together and taken apart and put together. And that, I believe, means a lot of it is going to have to be open source. So it's got a deep challenge to the intellectual property, corporate control, shut supply chains of the 20th century. Here's some examples of regenerative by design. Well, let's start with the mother, which is the earth regenerates when we give her a chance, when we restore the land, when we create terraces, allow rainwater to start collecting. And this is an example of, actually, it's a farm from the extraordinary photographer Sebastian Salgado. His farm, inherited in Brazil, totally hopeless landscape, and within 20 years, utterly gorgeous. And of course, this is happening the world over. Sanitation in some of the world's poorest settlements. This company in Nairobi set up in the settlements around the city a place where there were no toilets, installed micro toilets throughout the community, bringing dignity and health for the first time. The waste is collected every day, and it's turned into fertilizer and then sold to farmers who can grow far more nutritious and healthy vegetables as a result. So at the technical level, they're closing the cycle of the nutrient loop, but at the social level, they're creating jobs, health, enterprise, dignity. Modular design. In Amsterdam, there's this building which, if you look carefully, it's, first of all, it's largely made of timber. So it's sequestering carbon in the very design of the building. But all of the materials and timbers are not glued together, they're bolted and clipped together so that they can be unbolted and unclipped and used again. So this is modular design, ensuring that materials can be used and reused in the future. And then lastly, in one of those electronic waste dumps here in Togo, community began to reclaim this waste and started turning it into 3D printers and new computers, and began creating fab labs and generating their own digital centers. So what regenerative possibilities did these kinds of ideas inspire for you in your country? I want to close thinking about that, just stepping back and really thinking about the full scale of the potential that is there if we harness it in the right way, because every industrial system requires a means of production, a source of energy, a means of production, a form of communication, and a store of knowledge. And in the 20th century, the primary technologies used to do this were centralizing by design. A big oil rig or a coal mine or a gas pipeline for energy. Production in a big Fordist factory. Communications, literally every phone call in the 20th century went through a centralized switchboard, and knowledge was held in patents and copyrights, originally designed to release knowledge and make it shared, but anyone who knows the electronics industry or the pharmaceutical industry knows that they're actually now used aggressively to block others from innovating. Now, in the 21st century, The blessing we have is that for the first time in human history, the core technologies for energy production, communications, and knowledge are asking to be distributive by design. Energy is in renewable energy systems and microgrids in this village in India, in solar panels owned by communities and wind farms. Production can literally be a desktop 3D printer, printing buildings, ceramics, plastics, metals. It's downscaled that I'm literally sitting at my desk in like a little production studio in my own house. Technology and communications, we've all got a smartphone, a node of that communications network, as well as this woman in a village in Tanzania. And then knowledge is being opened up through Creative Commons licensing, which has only just begun. I mean, the possibilities about Creative Commons licensing are still being developed. For me, the exciting question, the one that gives me energy, is what possibilities can we imagine if the full potential of these distributive technologies were harnessed? What possibilities for communities everywhere does this unleash? So let me pull back. We need regenerative and distributive design. And I think one of the challenges for getting there is the design of government. And I would say the design of companies. But right now I'm going to focus on government because Andrew's following me talking about nations and cities. So I'm going to think about government and invite you to think about the government of your city or the government of your nation. Institutions need redesigning as well. Because again, the 20th century, governmental institutions are typically designed to serve a growth economy and to ask this one overriding question: how can we make our economy grow? And everything that's done is in the service of that. But the 21st century nation, seeking to be a thriving nation, will ask a very different question. And I hear it every time I hear Ed speaking about Costa Rica and the initiative there. How can we make our growing nation thrive? Totally different question, totally different goal. What is it that leaves some countries aiming to make the economy grow? And what is it that has others aiming to make the nation thrive? And I believe in terms of the design of government, it comes down to these 5 design traits that I learned from the brilliant analyst Marjorie Kelly: the purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. So I'm going to just describe a little bit about each of these through the lens of government. So a government that's in service to thriving. On the purpose, listen to the speeches, read the reports, look at the government documents. Are they talking about growth, competition, and expansion? Or actually, are they talking about being thriving, inclusion, being regenerative, being resilient? I've been struck by how many governments actually have started to pivot towards this in the context of COVID. Networks. How does the government relate to citizens and residents in the country? How does it relate to the change makers who are already making things happen? Is it threatened by them or embracing and working with them? What are its alliances? What international networks is it part of? And how does it procure? Is it taking advantage of the possibilities of working with anchor institutions? Is it working through global supply chains and has no idea about the impacts worldwide of where the products it's buying are coming from? Governance. Who has voice in decision making? What are the rules and practices by which decisions are made? What are the metrics used? Again, that's really key to what we're talking about today. What are the metrics used to judge success? And is there transparency in government spending and decision making? And then down to the really powerful stuff, ownership. Who owns the land of the city or of the nation? Who owns the utilities? Are they publicly or privately owned? Who owns the companies that are predominant in the country? Who owns the data that's now being generated? And who owns the power to generate finance? Because these ownership questions, and there are many more, these ownership questions take us down to the most powerful design trait, which is the question of finance. Where does that government's finance come from? Is it coming from taxes? Are they income taxes or corporate taxes, sales taxes? Is it coming from public utilities, running transport systems or electricity systems? Is it coming from foreign direct investment? To what extent is the country saddled with external debt? Did you know that there's over 60 countries in the world, in the low income countries, that pay more money every year in paying off external debt and interest payments than they can afford to invest in their own healthcare? How on earth are they supposed to meet the needs of all people in those conditions? And do they depend on overseas development assistance? So these 5 design traits, and we can apply it to a country, whether rich or poor. What is the purpose? What are your networks and how do you align them with thriving? Are you governing yourselves to be thriving? How are resources and assets owned, and what are the power relationships there? And how can those be turned to thriving? And then how can finance that's so often just in pursuit of endless growth itself. How can that be regenerated and turned to thriving? And I'm delighted that John Fullerton is going to be speaking as part of this series, because I think his work on regenerative finance is really powerful. So let me pull back and finish. 20th century economics started us with supply and demand of the market, rational economic man, and endless growth. Leave it behind because it does not serve us. Let's start with meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. Recognize the economy is embedded in society, embedded in the living world. That instead of the individualistic me, we need to create rules and understandings for the social we. We need regenerative and distributive design in our economies. And we need to create institutions, governments, and companies that align their purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance with these goals. Easy to say. Oh my goodness, what a transformative journey it is to make it happen. I'm going to finish by saying that Andrew and I are thick in the middle of working on getting our platform up and running for Doughnut Economics Action Lab. We invite everybody on this webinar to join if you're interested. We're launching in mid-late September. You are welcome to join. There you will meet other people from all around the world who are using the ideas of Doughnut and Doughnut Economics to turn it from a radical idea into transformative action. And we're focusing on working with cities and places, with community groups, with teachers and researchers, with government, and with business and enterprise. So I really welcome you to join us there. I'm going to stop here and look forward to what Andrew's going to share about how we're downscaling the Doughnut. Thank you very much.